I begin this webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet. I also acknowledge our gratitude that we share these lands today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move in unity to an Australia that is fair and just for all its Indigenous peoples. And in lieu of a prayer tonight, I'll read a passage from St. John Paul II's 1981 encyclical Labrum Exercens. It's at paragraph 8, and it really is the material upon which a prayer could be based. At this stage, he's talking about social justice and worker solidarity. In order to achieve social justice in the various parts of the world, in the various countries, and in the relationships between them, there is a need for ever new movements of solidarity of the workers and with the workers. This solidarity must be present whenever it is called for by the social degrading of the subject of work, by exploitation of the workers, and by the growing areas of poverty and even hunger. The Church is firmly committed to this cause, for she considers it her mission, her service, a proof of her fidelity to Christ, so that she can truly be the Church of the poor. And the poor appear under various forms. They appear in various places and at various times. In many cases, they appear as a result of the violation of the dignity of human work, either because the opportunities for human work are limited as a result of the scourge of unemployment, or because a low value is put on work and the rights that flow from it, especially the right to a just wage and to the personal security of the worker and his or her family. Over to you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Brian. And tonight we welcome Professor, or should I say Emeritus Professor James Franklin, retired Professor of Mathematics at the University of New South Wales. But actually Jim has a large volume of interests, including philosophy, especially the philosophy of mathematics, and also history, which is the title that brings him here tonight. He's published a number of books on various historical subjects, including his latest book, Catholic Thought and Catholic Action, Scenes from Australian Catholic Life. But tonight we've invited Jim to speak on the subject of Catholic social justice and the Australian Labor Party in the first 40 years of the 20th century. So I'm sure that's going to be a fascinating, perhaps even controversial subject. So thanks very much for being with us, Jim, and over to you.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks very much to your group for the invitation. In Europe in the early 20th century, Catholics like Sagnier and Cardine were concerned about justice for the workers, and they had a plan on what to do about it. At the same time in Australia, Catholics were also concerned about justice for the workers and acted to do something about it. But the political context of the two continents was completely different, and so were the plans. Or maybe the plans were not so totally different as it might appear at first. We'll think about that as we go along. The Australian plan had a lot less theory and a lot more pragmatism and politics, and a lot more success in implementation. Now, say you're a Catholic or fellow traveller in the early decades of the 20th century who thinks about how society should be more justly organised. You don't like unrestricted laissez-faire or rampant capitalism, and you're also suspicious of state socialism and revolutionary change. What are your alternatives? Of course, in reality, there are quite a few, but let's oversimplify to just two. There's a European or Melbourne plan, similar to Cardine and the Catholic worker in Melbourne. And on the other hand, there's a Sydney version of the Australian plan. Both of them start with rejecting laissez-faire capitalism or market socialism. The basic idea of distributism, and I'll follow it first and then look at the more Labor plan later. The basic idea of distributism is to democratise ownership for example, with small proprietors, cooperatives, workers having a say in the control of industry. As the leader of the anti-communist movement in Sydney, Dr. Paddy Ryan, in the mid-20th century put it, the trouble with capitalism is that there aren't enough capitalists. You need lots of small owners. So having decided on that theoretical position, you set up a magazine like Sanye's Le Sillon or The Catholic Worker in Melbourne in the 30s, and you put the message out to workers. It's observed that that didn't work very well. What with the lack of impact among the workers and suspicions from conservative forces in the church and cooperatives not being very economically successful in most cases, then distractions with communism, splits and so on. Race Matthews says, the question to be addressed is how a cause and conviction so recently in good standing in the eyes of many Australians, he means distributism, could have been erased from the nation's political agendas and public consciousness so totally for all practical purposes as if they had never existed. Well, actually, I'm not sure that distributed ownership is quite as dead as he says. Half of Australians own shares, and Macquarie Bank is called the millionaire's factory because a lot of staff share in the winnings. But maybe that's not quite what distributism had in mind. The alternative plan, which is the main subject of this talk, is one that there isn't a standard term for, but let's call it regulated capitalism or market socialism. Maybe it's much the same as what's sometimes called democratic socialism or social democracy, but those terms are confusing because they refer to politics, whereas what we're talking about here is economic organisation. Okay, now in parallel to what I said about distributism, let's run through what its basic idea is. The basic idea of regulated capitalism or market socialism is that instead of distributing ownership, you distribute money and protections. So capitalists are allowed to keep ownership or ownership in some sense, but what ownership means becomes very restricted. It's restricted by these means. Regulation, for example, industrial safety laws, the duty of care laws, banking regulations, laws on working hours and child labour, disclosure, truth in advertising, pollution laws, antitrust laws, and then minimum wage rates, and later compulsory superannuation, and then more recently, employment law like expectations of career paths, training, mentoring, bonuses, diversity and inclusion, anti-bullying and harassment, unfair dismissal laws. And then it's restricted by high taxes that are spent on a welfare state. Then organised labour is allowed to negotiate with owners from a position of strength. So if you're thinking of this from the position of the would-be rampant capitalist, you're thinking, how can I ever run a business with all that kind of red tape pinning me down? Well, to cause those wonderful things to happen, the plan was that the workers should organise unions. The unions should sponsor a Labor Party with parliamentary members tied to voting for party policy. The party should campaign and get elected, and then it should legislate its program. It should maintain tight organisation, gain the mass votes of the working class, and with luck find some support from on-side bishops. Well, the result was, and it still is, success beyond the originator's wildest dreams. To state the obvious, of the four economic plans, that is 1, extreme capitalism, 2, extreme socialism, 3, distributism, and 4, regulated capitalism, the latter, the fourth one, is the closest to what we've actually got. I fear people are not looking around and seeing that. It's probably for the reason explained in this old joke. 2 young fish are swimming upstream. They meet an old fish going downstream who says, "Enjoy the water, boys." They swim a bit more, and one of them says to the other, "What's water? What's regulated capitalism? You're swimming in it." That's the theory. Now let's get to the history. That is, the history of Labor politics in Australia from around 1890. There are two strands, a Labor history one and a Catholic one. Down the track they merge, but to begin with, say 1890 to 1910, they were separate. Well, first, let's look at the favourable background as of the 1880s or so for Labor politics in Australia. Already before 1880, there was close to universal male suffrage, even in the southeastern states anyway, for black males. As the British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury said, if you gave everyone the vote, the lowest class would have a majority and they just vote all the treasury to themselves. It's a bit of a mystery why that didn't happen. Or maybe if you'd been Lord Salisbury and looked at the future, you'd said, well, it did happen. Well, anyway, certainly with universal male suffrage or anything close to it, the poorer classes have a big political advantage. And from the time of the gold rushes and before, there were frequently shortages of labour, especially skilled labour, which also gave the workers an advantage. Workers could and did become premiers, and even Catholic ones. As Patrick Morgan points out, back in Ireland, the Irish had made little political progress in 7 centuries. But Victoria had an Irish Catholic premier over 20 years, only 20 years after Melbourne was founded. John, later Sir John O'Shaughnessy. Australia was founded as a government entity, that is a convict colony with everything done by the government. So everybody said, well, if there's a problem, the government ought to do something about it. Australia was founded as a government entity and was used to large-scale government enterprises, such as the state railways and education systems. The New South Wales Government Railways is one of the biggest state enterprises in the world. The Selection Acts of the 1860s or so were more radically socialist than many later proposals. They said that anyone could just go and take some of the great landed estates for themselves. An 8-hour day was achieved by Sydney stonemasons in the 1850s and was spreading. There weren't 10-year-olds in coal mines like there were in Britain. Well, Australia mightn't have been exactly the working man's paradise, but the balance was certainly better than in most countries. Well, then in the 1880s, the capitalists became alarmed by the rapid spread of unionism, and especially closed shop unionism. They decided to take a stand. In the 1890s dock strike and shearers' strike, they took on the unions and they won. In Queensland especially, where the capitalists controlled the government on their behalf sent troops with Gatling guns, but they didn't need to fire them because the shearers caved in. The response of the Labor movement was to move to parliamentary political action. The story is told in excellent detail in Bede Nairn's book, Civilising Capitalism. Many thanks to Michael Eason for calling my attention to that. In Sydney, the union movement organised the Labor Electoral League for the election suddenly called in 1891. They were surprised at their immediate success. They gained 35 members out of 141 Legislative Assembly seats, and they held the balance of power. It's regarded as the foundation of the Australian Labor Party, and their success continued with ups and downs, more or less to the present day. So the question for Labor was what their position and Labor would be. what their position and platform would be. The question for Labor in 1890 was what their position and platform would be. If it were France, you could read all about the vicious internal debates about degrees of socialism in their theoretical organs. But this is Australia, where everyone claims to be pragmatic. I must say, I, as a theorist, don't really believe in the distinction between theory and practice. It makes sense in theory, but in practice it doesn't. A pragmatic program is just a piece of theory you think might get up. Of course they had theory. Early Labor did have a coherent position, and you can see what it is in the 1891 platform of the Labor Electoral League. Labor policy didn't deviate much from the tone of this in later years. The main writer of it, well, of course, it's a committee document, but the main individual writer was Peter Brennan, one of the rare Catholics in the early Labor movement. The religious background of the early Labor men was much more commonly Methodist. I'll read you just a few selections from the platform. It has about 20 points which have subparts, but here are, I think, some pieces that give you the overview and a flavour of what they're doing. Platform 1, electoral reform, such as abolition of plural voting and various other things. Part 2, Platform 2, free, compulsory and technical education, including tertiary education paid for by the government. So it's not just about workers' rights, it has a kind of wider vision about society good for everyone. 3, an 8-hour day across the board. 4, Workshops and Factories Act, including, for example, supervision of land boilers and machinery. So a lot of concern about industrial safety and state supervision of workers' conditions. Point 7, repeal of the Masters and Servants Act, which is an old British thing that gave rather excessive rights to masters. 9, establishment of a Department of Labour, a national bank, and a national system of water conservation and irrigation. So nation building in a way that would later be called state socialism, but not nationalisation. So 10, federation, quote, on a nationalist as opposed to imperialistic basis. 13, a tax on capital gains in land value. 15, stamping of Chinese-made furniture, and a few others of a similar kind. Some absences to note are anything about social security like pensions and any platforms of nationalisation of industry. Labor's consistent electoral success and sufficient internal party unity with caucusing was able to extract concessions from governments that needed their support. For example, the Lynn government in New South Wales in 1900 granted non-contributory aged pensions. That's rather unusual. We're used to non-contributory age pensions in Australia, but they're on a world scale, they have been rather rare. Their greatest success was with the Fisher government, Fisher federal government of 1908 to 9, then 1910 to 13, which was the world's first national Labor majority government. Everyone was interested to see whether such a thing was possible or whether the sky would fall in. The Fisher government instituted some quite serious reforms, and by and large, they weren't repealed later. So, as a government instituting pro-worker reforms, you'd have to say it was one of the most successful long-term in history. Here are some of the things it did. Non-contributory old age and disability pensions, so that took over the schemes existing in some states. A maternity allowance of £5 to mothers, married or not. The arbitration system was extended to agricultural workers, domestics and federal public servants. So just before that, in 1907, the Harvester minimum wage case was a uniquely Australian way to go about things, in line with what Rerum Novarum had said. There was a legislated minimum wage. Now, according to classical economists, fixing wages for moral reason or any other prices is both impossible and harmful, but nevertheless, it appeared to work. And then the Fisher government also founded the Commonwealth Bank. So it didn't nationalise the existing banks, but it founded a Commonwealth Bank to compete with them. And it didn't do it on a level playing field either. The Commonwealth Bank had savings and general business. It had a government guarantee of deposits, which of course very attractive to depositors. And it had agencies in all post offices. So given the government certainly given its entity a leg up in the market. Nevertheless, the other banks certainly survived perfectly well. And finally, a land tax to break up larger states. One socialist measure that capitalists really don't like is a tax on assets, as a possibly non-productive assets, as opposed to sales or profits. It did, in the early years, break up some large squattocrat estates, but after a while, ways were found of getting around it. Now, those measures are, in one sense, quite seriously socialist, but they don't abolish private property and they don't literally nationalise businesses. One observer who was quite unhappy with the result was Lenin. In a short piece in Pravda in 1913, he asks this: "What sort of peculiar capitalist country is this, in which the workers' representatives predominate in the upper house, until recently did so in the lower house as well, and yet the capitalist system is in no danger?" Well, that's a good question, Vladimir Ilyich. He goes on to say, "Those liberals in Europe and in Russia who try to, quote, teach the people that class struggle is unnecessary by citing the example of Australia, only deceive themselves and others." He's right to be worried. If redistribution of wealth is proved to be possible in Australia without the revolution he's selling, then he has a problem. The later history of Labor politics is largely more of the same, and we don't have the time at the moment to say more. So let me switch to the other stream of early Labor history, the Catholic one. As is well known, Leo XIII wrote an encyclical, Rerum Novarum, in 1891 on the rights of labour and the need for a more cooperative organisation of society than the ones represented by extreme capitalism and extreme socialism. As is also well known, 99% of Catholics since have had no knowledge of or interested in this theory, or indeed in the questions that it answers. Of those who did take an interest, you are familiar with the distributors such as Chesterton, Cardine, and the Australian ones that are the subject of Race Matthews' excellent book of Labour and Liberty, Distributism in Victoria. But here I'm looking at another strand which threw in its lot with political labour. It was led by 4 archbishops who took their support for labour very seriously indeed, and did so more publicly than would be considered acceptable now. They are Cardinal Manning, Cardinal Moran, Archbishop Mannix, and Archbishop James Carroll, Gilroy's coadjutor in Sydney. Manning, of course, was in London, but the other 3 in Australia. Manning, Moran, and Leo XIII had been connected in Rome a couple of decades earlier when they were fixing up the declaration of papal infallibility. But around 1890, they saw eye to eye on the rights of workers. Here are a few thoughts of Moran. On the strike of 1890, he says this. Of course, the strike of 1890 is before Rerum Novarum, so not influenced by it. He says this: "I see no reason why labour should not combine. The present labour organisations are really only the old Catholic guilds under another name. Those guilds were formed to protect the workman from tyranny and to secure to the workman just payment for his skill and labour. When Labor had electoral success in 1891, he was right onto it. He says this: "May I not congratulate Australia in that, though the youngest on the roll of nations, she has been the first to add the strength and vigour of a Labor Party to her parliamentary representatives." Like Pope Leo, he was in favour of cooperation instead of class war. He says, "But the labourer should bear in mind that when he has redressed those laws and secured his rights, all antagonism should cease. It is his own interest that he should be so, lest pursuing capital with enmity, in the proverbial phrase, he kill the hen that lays the golden eggs." The Labor Party was not too sure if it wanted sectarian support, but he gave it to them anyway. Here are his comments of 1902. "Our Labor Party does not cherish any vague theories, any ambiguous and high-sounding formulae. Its object is precise reforms and concrete measures in favour of the toiling masses. If we showed aversion to the labour movement, we would drive the toiling masses from the church, which would become unpopular. But do not imagine that our sympathetic attitude towards this movement is one of opportunism, or that it is a kind of apostolic manoeuvre. No, it is with our whole heart that we sympathise with the rise of the people." Labor had a perennial theoretical issue over its socialisation objective, which became part of its platform when it briefly veered towards extreme socialism in 1897. It appeared to call for the nationalisation of all industry, which was probably not compatible with Catholic commitment to private property. Angst about the socialisation objective broke out about it every so often. For example, in 1905, when a Catholic layman wrote a long article in the Catholic press in Sydney, alleging Labor were now undisguised socialists. The headline is interesting for the implication that Labor must have been doing a good job disguising it so far. Well, Chris Watson, who'd recently served as the first Labor Prime Minister, briefly, wrote to Moran to assure him that there's nothing to worry about. Labor socialism wasn't serious. Moran came to the party with a rather surprising comment. He says, "If men in the advancement of their political interests choose the name of socialists, I say again, what's in a name if the false maxims of communism are not adopted by those men?" Well, all was one big happy family, and from around 1910, there developed the close connection between the Catholic working class and Labor that persisted into the days of the Carl government in the 1950s. It's epitomised from a story from Marrickville in inner Sydney in the 20s. It's possibly apocryphal but very old, and it embodies people's perceptions. A woman member arrived at a Labor branch meeting late and a little flustered. She accidentally genuflected. Everybody laughed and she said, "Well, it's all the same faces." My story of the Catholic lay associations and the Carl government is in my book, mentioned by Stefan, Catholic Thought and Catholic Action, Scenes from Australian Catholic Life. I'll finish with something about Mannix. He's significant not only for what he said, but because he inspired some genuine men of action. In 1917, the year he succeeded as Archbishop of Melbourne, he gave a long speech on Catholic principles, which covers many issues, but has a considerable section on labour questions. It includes these comments. "The Church stands first of all for the worker's right to a living wage. Leo XIII seems to have opened the eyes of the world. Governments are bound to provide against unemployment. We have many who value religion mainly, perhaps solely, for keeping the proletariat quiet. And what wonder if idle, starving men find themselves driven into socialism? He gained an enthusiastic following among the workers, despite his own patrician background and demeanour. When the British government urged the Vatican to rein him in for his inflammatory speeches on Irish republicanism, the Secretary of State replied that it was rather awkward. Quote, "It must not be forgotten that Monsignor Mannix, rightly or wrongly, enjoys a great influence upon the working classes. Proofs of this are the imposing and clamorous demonstrations in Sydney and Melbourne. Therefore, severe measures taken against him by the Holy See would undoubtedly aggravate the situation and create grave difficulties for the government itself." A contrast, isn't it, to what was happening in France, where it was all about losing the working class. Here, the Catholics were the working class, or at least a fair portion of it, and not only that, were a large part of the political party representing them. He was still going in the 1930s. This is from an account of his speech in Newcastle in 1938. "It's the big financial experts of the world who control the money. These are the people to whom the Pope has addressed his most caustic remarks, and these are the people who will have to release their grip on the world." And the newspaper report of this, after that quote, continues with this: "Mr. B.A. Santamaria, M.A. LLD, proposing a vote of thanks, said that the three requirements for social justice in Australia were redistribution of income, redistribution of property, and installation of vocational groups as the controlling force in industry." The mention of Santamaria is a reminder that Mannix had a very long political reach through his influence on three men who rose to political prominence. James Scullin, Australia's first Catholic Prime Minister, and that was something possible in Australia decades before other Anglophone countries. Arthur Corwell, Australia's first Minister for Immigration and later opposition leader. And B.A. Santamaria, leader of the movement. So we don't have time to tell their stories, but they're fairly well known. I promise a short biography of Corwell soon. To conclude, the take-home message is this. Rerum Novarum urged that society be arranged in a cooperative way that avoided the extremes of laissez-faire capitalism or state socialism. The dominant right wing of the Australian Labor Party developed a consistent ideology that did that, but in a somewhat different way from distributism. It proved politically very successful, and it's a major cause of the fairly successful regulated capitalism or market socialism that we live in today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was a wonderful tour de force of the development of social justice in Australia, according to the Labor Party, and Catholic involvement in battling for that. Ranging from Cardinal Manning to Lennon to Archbishop Mannix in Melbourne, and of course B.A. Santamaria. So I'm sure that's really provoked a lot of thought among the people participating. So if anybody does have a question, feel free to do so, and feel free, in fact, just to jump in and make a comment. If I cannot see you on the screen, just feel free to jump in. I'll see if I can.
I have a question.
Rob.
Jim, you mentioned Lenin animadverting in Pravda about Australian socialists not having the right revolutionary stuff. Something that I've wondered about and have never known, though you probably do know, was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal influenced at all by the Australian Labor Party example? I mean, it's fairly well known, and historians have often written about how it took various traits from Mussolini and corporatism and so forth, but I've never actually known whether the example of an Australian Labor Party, such as America has never really had, was had any sort of influence on the movers and shakers of the New Deal?
I must say I've no idea. Does anybody know that?
I certainly don't have much knowledge of it, but it's an interesting thing to look into for sure. Yeah.
Herbert Hoover had a good time in Australia, and learnt a lot, but I don't think he learnt much socialism.
No. Oh.
Interesting question. Somebody should look into that.
Yes. LBJ had a good wartime time here.
Oh, yes, that's right. I don't think he absorbed much socialism either.
No, I don't suppose he did.
Anybody else like to pipe in with a question? I was going to ask, what was the impact of Lenin's comments? Did they have any impact in Australia at all?
No, I don't think they were known in Australia. They are translated into English only decades later, I think, and
right.
Comrades studied them, but I'm not sure what they made of them.
Yeah.
Of course, the comrades here agreed entirely that the Australian Labor Party lacked sufficient revolutionary zeal, which they were happy to supply and infiltrate it, but they failed to do that.
Yeah. Another question I was going to ask was relating to Cardinal Manning. Did he actually have a lot of influence in Australia? Or was it just like a few? Well, yeah, actually, what influence did he actually directly have?
Not as far as I know. I don't know. I'm not aware of people here reading him. I'm not even sure how well Moran knew him. That is an interesting question. How I get the impression that Moran did know his thinking, but I don't remember, in the little I've read, and I'm certainly no expert on Moran and his thought, I'm not aware of him talking about it. Again, perhaps we should ask if people here do know that.
Yeah, anybody feel free to jump in if you've got any knowledge on that. Yeah, I will say that Manning was a big influence on Cardine. I mean, actually, when Cardine finally went to the UK in 1911, well, of course, I think Manning was already long gone, but the people he went to meet were the dockers. And also, to see the connection. It's interesting. The dockers that he met there described themselves as Christian socialists, but when Cardine went back to Belgium and he wrote about it, he didn't mention the fact that they were Christian socialists, because in the Belgian context at that time, socialism was by definition anti-clerical and anti-Catholic.
That's right. You can't be too careful with your choice of words in an atmosphere like that. So that was why I was so surprised at Moran being quite happy with the word socialist in 1905. Of course, that's before condemnations by Pius X. But even so, it's seeing him so insouciant, you might say, about the word socialist is a little strange. But then, yeah, you're right. A lot of terms can mean something a lot less extreme when they come to Australia and everything's upside down.
Yes.
Stefan?
Yep, Des. Go for it, Des. Yep.
Isn't the Cardinal Manning at the Ballarat Trades Hall Council building? They has been up there for about 60 or 80 or something years, so he must have had some influence.
Oh, right, interesting. So
Brian Lawrence is nodding his head. Am I right, Brian?
Well, I've heard that. I haven't seen the painting, but it's been around for a long time. Manning, and the Dockers strike was quite widely reported in Australia, and Cardinal Manning's role in the settling of the Dockers strike was crucial, and that coincided with a lot of problems with strikes around about the same time, 1890, 1891, 1892. And so Manning's role was really quite critical in the development of thought in Australia on the setting of a just wage, because essentially what Manning did was to set a just wage for the dockers in London, and so that had a big impact on the thinking of trade unionists in Australia. So you could see why at Ballarat Trades and Labor Council, or Trades Hall, I'm just not sure what the term is that they use, why they would have a painting of him.
Yeah, interesting. Certainly there was a lot of interest and support from Australian unionists about the London dock strike. In fact, the Sydney Trades and Labor Council sent the London dockers a large sum of money, which helped them win their case, but then left the locals back home without enough money to win their own dock strike. So there's certainly there was a lot. Everybody knew what was going on following the news about those strikes, and the language is similar. Actually, Manning's language is in a way stronger than the somewhat abstract language of Moran and Manning's. Manning describes in rather harrowing detail 10-year-olds pulling carts in mines, which you don't see in Australia, partly because there wasn't the same child labour in Australia. Manning gives more of the impression of being emotional, sort of viscerally emotional about the appalling conditions.
James, could I ask you this question? In Australia, until recently, 54% of workers were members of unions. Now, how much do you think that the commitment of ordinary workers to trade unions led to all of this success for the Labor Party?
Well, it was essential to it, I would say. It's certainly at least up to the 60s, the Labor Party was very much based on its union base, and it couldn't have existed without it. Of course, there was always some tension between the union half of the Labor movement and the parliamentary party, and the unionists were always thought that the parliamentarians were feathering their own nests and not being adequately socialist. Nevertheless, the unions themselves, the Labor would have been nowhere without its union base, absolutely. And now, as you say, things are rather different. In the post-Whitlam era, the Labor base went somewhere else, and we talk about the inner city latte sippers and so forth, who don't join Labors and have got different agendas. And the workers who are in trouble today, like people delivering pizzas, they're not in the least unionised.
That's right. And that's one of the why do you think that has occurred?
I can't say I can cast too much light on that. Well, I did, let me tell you, it's a one-off story, but I did quit my own union. My union as an academic was NTEU, and I was a member of it for 30 years. And then I quit when they gave $1 million donation to the Greens for political purposes. I said, I'm not doing that. Yes, I feel as
though all of these people that you're talking about, Mannings and the Pope and all the rest of it, that they were inspired to do their theological work by the efforts of trade union members who were demanding justice. They did not initiate it. The workers themselves initiated it. They just gave a theological assessment of it all.
Well, yes and no. I mean, there were, of course, the workers were standing up for themselves. And let's say we're talking about the 1880s, but then Cardinal Manning sees poor people, they're underfoot, whether he doesn't have to listen to the representative of the workers, even though he then goes and sees them. It's the direct knowledge of children down coal mines that is worrying him.
I think there's too much emphasis on the theologians in all of this in the Catholic Church, and not enough emphasis on the leaders of the trade union movement, and then they move to the Labor Party.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. That was why I said there's two strands, and they come together. But I agree entirely that we should be studying the union strand. We should go, and people should know better. Peter Brennan, the Trades and Labour Council head of the 1890, who got the platform underway, a great organiser. And absolutely, yeah, I agree that if you're studying it, even from the Catholic point of view, you shouldn't. Yeah, you should put the union leaders, whether Catholic or not, front and centre. Absolutely,
front and centre.
Yeah.
I'm going to a conference in actually St Andrews next week, and ACU are holding a reception there. So I'll try and bring it up and say, hey, have you got any academics studying this, or PhD students or the like? I think I really do think it's an area that's been neglected and really kind of, needs to be known better. Yeah. Another question I was going to ask was what you actually adverted to earlier, about the fact that basically the Labor Party's gone to, the Labor movement's gone the union sort of wages battle track and hasn't done much on the distributism sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts about why that happens?
Well, I suppose you'd say that Labor has been captured by the Whitlam generation, who are doing just fine as lawyers and bankers and so forth. Shall we talk about the politically correct lot? Well, the Labor Party, of course, always had the problem that it had to put together different constituencies so that it got over the line of 51% or whatever it needs to win. It has to keep a lot of people happy. If it's lost a certain amount of zeal, well, that's how it goes.
Well, actually,
we should look at ask Mr. Minns whether he's an old style Labor Catholic leader and what he's going to do. Let's see what happens.
Yeah, but actually, when I think about it, actually, it's not just the Labor Party lost that distributor strand, it's also the church itself. I mean, for a long time, maybe in the wake or before Rerum Novarum, and you also mentioned the word cooperation from Leo XIII, which was translated into the development of cooperatives. And you can probably see up to around the 60s, well, for example, in the Victoria, the YCW was a very strong proponent of that, and I think probably in other states in different ways. But it's kind of also disappeared from Catholic discourse, hasn't it? It's a real problem. Yeah. We're not putting the alternatives out there. Maybe because we've all got shares in our super, I don't know.
Yeah, well, we all.
James, can I ask you this?
Jim, could I? Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Kevin, you finish and then over to Carl.
Who has got the floor?
Someone else have a go. I'm going to ask another question.
All right, then you go, Carl. Maybe over to you, Carl.
Thanks, Stefan. Thank you very much for organising this, and many thanks to you, Jim, for a very illuminating paper. Particularly, I found the quotations that you provided from Mannix and Moran really fascinating, as well as many of your other remarks. But one other international comparison I've long been intrigued by is with Poland and the Solidarity movement. Lech Wałęsa as the leader and longtime friend of John Paul II, even before he became Pope, and the importance of the strikes. We talk about the London dock strikes, rightly with Manning, but the strikes that occurred in Gdansk, in the seaports there on the Baltic, involving the Solidarity movement, and the significance of that alliance that he had with John Paul II, and the influence it had on finally the downfall of the Soviet Empire. Different situations, but there's common elements in terms of of communist control and very strong union influence being fundamental, worker influence, and also papal intellectual influence and leadership influence. So some fascinating combination of elements. I just think there's obvious great differences, but I've just been interested in how
that's a good point.
That's
a great,
very important example of Catholic social thought in action, leading to a major political impact.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very interesting parallel, and it just shows that workers demanding justice and papal archbishops being in favour of justice as well can be an alliance, and that the French style, where the church is in bed with monarchism or something, is not the only way to go.
All right. Point. Maybe we can go back to you, Kevin, or unless there's somebody else putting up their hand.
Yeah, I'll just ask this question. I know it's going to be difficult, but James, what effect do you think that Santa Maria had on the trade union movement and the Catholic Church's commitment to worker justice?
Well, that certainly is a big question, and for those who think it's still 1955, anything you say is going to be create some unhappiness. Well, there I mean, different things. Of course, in one sense, the split, which was partly Santa Maria's fault and partly Evatt's fault, resulted in a lack of a Labor government in around 1960, and the workers might have been better off if there had been a Labor government. So in that sense, Santa Maria and Evatt did an extremely bad job. And there's some talk about this and how Cornwall might have been an alternative. As I said, I'm just completing a short biography for Connor Court's series of biographies on Cornwall. He certainly had a lot of bad luck in the people he had to deal with in the 50s. But then again, remember that there's an alternative way of doing things, which is the Sydney way, which didn't have a split. And the Carl government, and they did things in a way that was kind of favourable to the workers. Joe Carl was a worker, and so were his offsiders. They were running a government that was well, you remember everybody complains about Santa Maria and his minions were trying to infiltrate and take over the government to the Labor Party to get into the government and implement their Catholic theoretical perspective. Well, in Sydney, they'd done that. The Catholics had taken over the Carl government and were running things their way. And you can look at it and see if you think that's a good idea or not, but they were certainly a successful government. An opera house, which might seem an odd thing for the workers, but actually Carl said the workers do need an opera house. It'll be great for them and they'll be able to go there cheap. Well, a lofty ambition indeed. Maybe it didn't quite work out. But maybe other people would like to weigh in on that.
Sure. Anybody else like to actually weigh in or comment or question? Yep. Well, we've been going for an hour now, so if there is any kind of final questions, feel free to pipe up right now, because otherwise we'll move towards a close. Yeah, it's never been cheap, Guy Masters' comments in the chat. It's never been cheap to go to the opera house. Yeah.
Well, it would have been if Joe Carl was still alive at the opening, I tell you.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. All right then. Well, I think I don't see any more hands up right now. So I'd just like to move to. Oh, sorry, who is that? I didn't.
It's Kevin again, Stefan.
Yep,
Could
go
I
for
say,
it.
James, I've ordered his book and I expect it to turn up sometime next week. I'm really looking
Good.
forward to it.
Hope you like it.
Yeah, well, that's good, Kevin. And thanks for that reminder of Jim's book. And also, I think we'll all be looking out for his latest book as well, or next book, I should say, because, yeah, as you mentioned, Corwell, an important figure also from a Catholic point of view, who we should know about. And thanks, Reg. I see you've joined us, Reg, in the background with your companion there in the background. Anyway, whatever.
Yeah, sorry, Steph. I've been caught up. I've been a bit crook, so missed it. But I'll be keen to watch the recording. I see that it's being recorded, so I really want to actually watch it from start to finish. So I'm looking forward to it.
All right. Thanks a lot for joining us anyway, Reg. So anyway, well, with that, I'd just like to move to a formal thank you for Jim for joining us. And really, there's so much more to follow up from this, perhaps even in future webinars with different aspects that people have mentioned. And I'm sure that we're all looking forward to reading, well, both the Corwell book forthcoming and also the Catholic Thought and Catholic Action book. So once again, thanks very much, James, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
And questions.
I'll turn off the recording now in case anybody wants to say anything they don't want recorded. Oops. Yeah, the recording button not even turned.
Could I just add one little thing?